I've seen way too many friends go for the budget-friendly pre-built gaming rigs that look good on paper, only to end up swapping out the power supply or reinstalling Windows a week later because something overheated or the storage filled up faster than expected. The regret is real, and it usually starts the moment you realize the cheap chassis you paid for can't keep a high-end GPU cool enough for a serious 1080p TO 1440p session. So the question I keep getting is, does this Skytech desktop actually feel like a smarter buy, or is it just another flashy box with a price tag that masks hidden compromises? Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. First off, let's talk about the everyday scenario most gamers face. You sit down after a long day, fire up a recent title, maybe Cyberpunk 2077, Elden Ring, or the latest Call of Duty, and you want everything to run smooth, without stuttering or those dreaded GPU driver crashed alerts. With the Skytech model, the core of the system is an Intel i7-13700F, which means you're getting 12 performance cores and 8 efficiency cores all packed into a single silicon piece. In practice, that translates to near-instant level loading in open-world games and the ability to keep a decent frame rate while you have a few tabs open for Discord or a music streaming service. I've watched streamers using similar CPUs, and the multitasking headroom is noticeable, no more having to close your voice chat because the game hiccups. The graphics side is where the super in RTX 4070 Super actually matters. The card brings 12 GB of GDDR6 memory and hardware-accelerated ray tracing, which, in a real-world test, meant I could crank up medium-high settings in Shadow of the Tomb Raider at 1440p and still stay above 60 frames per second. The 360mm AIO cooler with ARGB fans does a decent job keeping the GPU temperature in the low 70s even after an hour of continuous battle. That's a clear win over many cheaper builds that rely on a single 120mm fan and end up throttling under load. However, the cooler is a dual radiator system that sits behind the case's side panel, and that design forces you to keep the side panel open if you ever need to swap a drive or add another fan. For a tidy desk setup, that could be a minor annoyance. Storage is another point that often trips people up with pre-built rigs. Skytech gives you a 2TB NVMe SSD straight out of the box. In everyday use, that feels like a huge advantage. You'll have enough room for Windows, a handful of AAA titles, and a growing library of mods without constantly juggling what stays and what goes. The speed of a modern NVMe drive also cuts load times dramatically. I saw Borderlands 3 drop from a 20-second load on an older SATA SSD to under 7 seconds here. That said, the drive is soldered onto the motherboard tray, which means upgrading to a larger SSD later isn't as simple as sliding a new drive into a spare slot. If you anticipate needing 4 TB or more down the line, you'll have to plan for an external solution or a complete system overhaul. Now let's address who should actually consider this machine. If you're a mid-range gamer who wants to hit 1440p with ray tracing enabled, or a content creator who needs a solid CPU for video editing on top of gaming, the combination of the i7-13700F and the RTX 4070 Super gives you a sweet spot without jumping to a $3,000 workstation. The 32 GB of DDR5 RAM running at 5600 MHz also means you won't be swapping out memory for years, which is a comfort for anyone who runs virtual machines or heavy multitasking. On the other hand, if you're a competitive esports player who lives for ultra-high frame rates at 1080p, you might find the 75 Hz refresh cap of most monitors you pair with this system limiting. You'd probably be better off with a card that leans more toward raw rasterization speed rather than ray tracing. Likewise, budget-conscious buyers who are okay with 1080p settings should look at cheaper builds. This machine's price reflects its higher-end GPU and large SSD, which you might not fully utilize. One practical weakness that shows up after the first few weeks is the Wi-Fi module. It's an 802.11 AC adapter, which is fine for most home routers, but it doesn't reach the speeds of newer Wi-Fi 6E cards. In a house where the router sits across multiple rooms, you could see a 20–30% dip in download bandwidth compared to a system with a modern chipset. It's not a deal breaker if you're plugging into Ethernet, but it's something to keep in mind if you rely on a wireless connection. Also, the case itself is a typical mid-tower with a tempered glass side, which looks great on stream but can be a bit heavy to move. If you're planning on relocating your setup often, say, moving between a home office and a dorm, might feel less portable than a smaller mini ITX build. Overall, the Skytech gaming desktop delivers what its headline specs promise, and the real-world experience backs that up: fast load times, solid frame rates.